All right, everyone. So welcome to our 46th edition of our webinars. We're almost coming to the 50th webinar mark, which is already an achievement. We started this project last year and we're almost in the half century. So today we're going to be talking with Dr. Katerina Lisenkova. And Katerina, it's a pleasure to have you today. So thanks for accepting our invitation. And we hope we have a fruitful conversation today. So just an introduction, Dr. Katerina Lisenkova is an economist for the NatWest Group with more than 15 years of professional experience. Her most recent focus is in the area of climate change, climate stress testing, and scenario analysis. She has presented her work to a wide variety of audiences, including experts, policymakers, and the general public. Katerina has also given oral written evidence to the select committees of the UK and Scottish parliaments, and she has also appeared in national and international media discussing current economic issues and her research. So today we will talk about the economic impacts, both short-term and long-term, of climate change. Katerina will also share with us how the finance industry, which could be seen as the nucleus of the whole system, is important, why it plays a key role to turn things around in the climate change perspective. Moreover, she will also share with us how, using all the different climate, economic, and financial variables that we currently have at hand, how we can use them to model the impacts of climate in the economy. For the past years, we have seen different governments and companies make promises and set goals in regards to climate change, and more specifically in regards to emission. We have seen some of them actually achieving some of these goals, but some of them who have not achieved these goals and are far away from doing it. We have also heard time and time again, for instance, yesterday or the past 2 days, it was the Bloomberg Climate Summit. And even though we always hear that we're improving, there is always things to do, and what we're doing is not enough. So we need to achieve the targets to be safe. So it is of the utmost importance to understand what needs to be done from the core of the economy, which is the financial sector. It is also vital to know how to use the data available as inputs to better understand and how and when we can reach these goals through modeling. Moreover, looking at what we currently have at hand, all the data and the variables that we have, it is key to understand what else we need to improve this modeling for different companies, and also to improve asset valuation for a reliable decision-making process. So before I give the floor to Katerina, I would like to remind you that you can use the chat to ask your questions. I will collect all the questions, and then at the end we can have a Q&A session. So without further ado, Katerina, please, if you could share your screen. Yeah.
Now I'm on mute. Hello, Hector. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today, and welcome all to my home office. This is such a strange times that we have to operate in a very different format than usual. I don't know about you, but I haven't been in my office since March last year, so that's it all feels less temporary and more permanent now. But today we're going to be talking about a different challenge, climate change. A pleasant thing about it in the context of pandemic is that despite the fact that we are in a 100-year shock, global economic shock, we're still talking about climate change. So the focus hasn't been removed from this issue, and this gives us hope that going forward, we're going to continue dealing with it. And I would like to start with the quote. Why is it so pertinent? Saying that we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last one that can do anything about it. So that's why all this activity around this issue that really has picked up over the past 6 years, and in particular, especially in the last couple of years. I want to talk to you and kind of take you on the journey, my own personal journey. I started working in this area about 2 years ago, and just tell you a story about how I approach this issue and how NatWest Group is approaching this issue, how the banks in the West are dealing with this, what's already happening and what we expect is going to be happening in the future, and also the question of modeling, because I'm a modeler. I was coming from the perspective of how can we take into account the climate effects on the economic variables, and I will just share with you something that I learned on this journey over the past couple of years. So, and to start with, let me see, to start with, I want to show you what are we talking about, and these are so-called warming stripes, and this they show the temperature in Russia between 1901 and 2019. So the dark blue lines show you that the year was colder than expected, and the bright red show that the year was warmer than expected. And you can see how the temperature profile is changing over the course of the century. And one thing that I discovered, I'm always trying to get some context from for the audience that I'm speaking to. One thing that I discovered yesterday is that over the past 50 years, Russia is warming 2.5 times faster than the world on average. So your region is experiencing warming firsthand and much more than some others. For example, I'm in the UK at the moment, and the UK is not warming that fast. And basically we are not, well, some would say we're not as lucky because I'm at the very north, I'm in Scotland, but in principle, yeah, we have a little bit of less of a pressure from this point of view. And moving forward, the question is what is going to happen in the future? And here there is a huge uncertainty. And the biggest uncertainty here is because it depends on us, on the humankind, of what we will do collectively to stop climate change. And that's why we start right away talking about the scenarios. And here in this chart, I'm showing you the global greenhouse gas emissions and various projections of what will happen or what needs to happen for a certain level of warming to materialize by the end of the century. So we're always discussing this in terms of the warming relative to pre-industrial average. Currently, we are about 1.1 degree warmer than during the pre-industrial period. And in the future, if we do nothing and continue along the trend that was observed over the past couple of decades, then by the end of the century, the warming is going to be above 4 degrees Celsius. So this is this gray area on the chart. But the governments and the different countries and companies are setting the pledges, the blue bars, the blue areas in this chart are showing you what current policy or current pledges are going to lead us to. So this is more or less in line with the pledges that were made after the 2015 Paris Agreement was signed. You can see that even though the Paris Agreement set itself a target of limiting climate change to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees, currently collective pledges are not enough to achieve this level. So we are somewhere in between 2.5 and 3 degrees currently with the policies that are already set out. But the whole focus of the Paris Agreement, the focus of the current discussion in financial industry and discussions between the governments is that we need to limit our warming much more substantially. Preferably 2 degrees definitely, but preferably 1.5 degree. And you can see that these are the yellow and the green line at the bottom of this chart, and both of them require negative emissions by the end of the century. So the challenge is huge. The time that we have to turn things around is limited and running out very quickly. So therefore, we need to start acting now. There is no time for delay. And when we are talking about the effects of the climate change, the easier type of effects to understand are physical effects. The interesting thing about the physical effects that they are very different and depend very much on where you are located on the globe. For example, UK, the most important physical impacts that we're going to experience from climate change, from global warming, is flooding. I looked at the projections for Russia. So this is the Hydromet Center forecast for what is going to happen and how much warming you can expect in the worst case scenario. In this, on the previous chart, I was showing you these gray bars. This is when we do nothing and continue as we are. But by the end of the century, this is what the temperature increase is going to be across the different regions in Russia. And this is quite shocking, I have to say, because this forecast on a global average, as you have seen, is about 4-degree warming by the end of the century, so about 4.1 or 4.5, depending on different assumptions. But in Russia, in the same scenario, in certain regions, especially in the north, you're going to see 11-degree warming in the winter. So this is almost 3 times as much as a global average increase in temperature. And it will have a huge impact, obviously, on everything, and especially, well, more floods, more droughts, but especially melting of the permafrost. And 2/3 of the territory of Russia is covered by permafrost, and if it's going to melt, then the whole of infrastructure that relies on support of the permafrost is going to be damaged. It includes pipelines, it includes bridges and houses, the heating systems. So, you know, the whole host of the infrastructure in the north that currently is supported by the permafrost is going to be ravaged. And the next big question is what is going to be happening with the warming itself if permafrost is going to melt, because it stores a big deposits of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, and carbon as well. So this is the big question for the climate modelers, but for the country itself, this is a real challenge. Obviously, it also opens a lot of opportunities, like seafaring in the North Sea, then agriculture will be able to develop on a much larger territories, the access to the Arctic shelf. But the interesting thing for me between the challenges and the opportunities is that the challenge is automatic. So they're going to happen to you whether you prepare for them or not. But while the opportunities, you will have to change the way you operate to be able to get any benefits. So there is this kind of asymmetry between the costs and the benefits. One is kind of more dangerous than the benefits you will need to, you know, invest and change the operating rhythm and the plans, the way you using your territory, your country, and your land. So here, that's the new news to me, and yeah, I haven't expected that Russia is going to be so negatively affected by the climate change. But this is at the end of the century. So in some respect, people who are currently in the room and we are discussing it, for us, it's less of an issue because we most likely are not going to survive that long. So the impacts that are going to influence us the most are going to be transition impacts from climate change, and transition impacts, they're coming in all sorts of flavors and shapes. This is referring to the policies set by the governments. This is referring to the technology available for us to transition. This is changing taste of the consumers and the general public. So obviously a different mix of this is going to influence how quickly and how successfully we transition from the high carbon world we are now to the low or even no carbon world that we want to turn by the middle of the century. And another kind of purpose of this, not purpose, but this kind of side effects of those transition risks is bringing the future costs to the present. So through this, we are bringing this future devastation that is going to come from the physical impacts of climate change closer to the present, so that we can address it now. And one way of how these future costs have been brought to the present is by government setting the net zero targets. On this map, I'm showing you all the countries that are already announced or considering and soon going to announce these net zero targets. Already 127 countries done so, and it covers 63% of emissions, of global emissions. So that's a huge success, considering that only a couple of years ago, when the UK was setting its target, there was only a minority of countries that done the same. So, and UK was actually the first country that set it in law. So this is a legal requirement to our government to ensure that by 2050, UK has net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, big wins over the last year. First one is China setting its net zero target by 2060. And then the change of administration in the United States, first of all, US joining the Paris Agreement again, and also setting itself a net zero target. A couple of weeks ago, Biden had this big climate summit where many world leaders were present, and they were kind of arguing for setting more serious targets and more serious commitments before the COP26. Another thing that COP26 feels much more real for me than previous summits, because it's going to be in Glasgow this year, and I'm talking to you from Glasgow, so hopefully it will be an interesting event to witness a historic change, hopefully, in our attitude to climate change. So on this chart, I'm just showing you a list of various transition parameters of how we are going to go around changing the way we power our economy through phasing out coal, banning internal combustion engine cars. By the way, in UK, internal combustion engine cars are banned. New sale of these cars is banned from 2030. Then all the scenarios, all these aggressive scenarios rely on carbon pricing and the border adjustments for carbon for emissions. European Commission is seriously discussing how they're going to introduce border adjustment. I was speaking to people in Ukraine and in Belarus recently, and they were saying, especially Ukraine, they are very focused. All of the industrial groups and industrial lobby groups, they're saying that all of their members are very much focused on how they're going to be dealing with this border adjustment and how they need to transition themselves in order not to pay these punitive costs. The plan for the European Union carbon border adjustment is to be implemented in 2023. So we're talking about very rapid transition. Another news in this area was that Canada introduced the carbon pricing. They had a limited level of carbon prices, but now they set themselves a target of how they're going to be increasing it every year by $15 per ton. And by 2030, they expect that their carbon price is going to reach $170 per ton. So this is, again, instant and very quick transition. If we are going to start pricing carbon, obviously everything is this is going to help the change, speed up the change very quickly. We economists always argued for the carbon prices because we see it as a very simple mechanism to set the incentives right. If you don't want certain activity to happen, you make it expensive. So this is how you send the signals. Then technological advancements across the board, from the carbon capture and storage to changes in agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonize. It's actually not decarbonization what they need, but removal of the greenhouse gases, because the most important gases that the agriculture is responsible for are nitrous oxide and methane, and they're both much more potent greenhouse gases than the carbon dioxide. Just to give you an example, in the UK, agriculture is responsible for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that it's only 0.6% of the UK GDP. So it just gives you some picture of how important the emissions from this sector, and it will be very difficult to decarbonize. Then obviously energy efficiency. This is it's not a glamorous area of transition, but it will be a very important one. And of course the renewable energy. But regulation and setting the targets and making the policies at the government level is not the only driver of change. And technology is playing a huge role. And so far, we actually kind of overshooting our most optimistic projections. On this chart, I'm showing you on the right-hand side the cost of electricity. It's called the levelized cost of electricity. This means for the whole duration of the project, from start to finish, how much is 1 megawatt of power is going to cost. And on these calculations, you see that over the past 10 years, the solar energy decreased by almost 90%, and the wind by almost 60%. And on the left-hand side, there is a map that shows what is the cheapest source of electricity in different countries. In UK, for a few years already, wind is the cheapest source of electricity, and you can see there are quite a few countries that are covered in blue. This means that wind is the cheapest energy there. There are a few countries where solar is the cheapest. Obviously, UK will never be one of those. And in Russia, gas is still the cheapest source of electricity, but I think Russia also has quite substantial resources for renewable energy, and the question is when you're going to start tapping into those resources. So now going back to the financial sector, because this is where we started. Why finance? And I see that at least in the UK, definitely there is an attempt by the government, by our regulator, to use finance as a catalyst to transition, to use the financial sector, first of all, to help, but also to make sure that there is a financial stability and the process is orderly, and it doesn't create any disruptions. This is a picture which was created by the Bank of England when they were trying to explain to us and to everybody else why the banks have to take it seriously. And basically, it's difficult to argue against this. The banks do see it in the heart of the global economy, allocating capital and risks. So on one hand, we're determining the future economy, the structure of the future economy, and how quickly transition can happen through allocation of capital. And on the other hand, all the risks of our clients at the end of the day end up on our books. So if we don't take into account the climate risks, this means that eventually the financial institutions are going to suffer. And if those risks are systemic, as climate risks are, so there is no easy way to diversify out of those risks, then if all the banks are exposed to them, it can pose systemic risks. And this was the reason why in 2015, I want to say that the Bank of England was probably the first regulator that started taking it seriously. And the whole idea that financial sector is at risk from climate change is originating from the Bank of England. And specifically Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time. He famously wrote a speech called Tragedy of the Horizon before the Paris meeting in 2015. And this is, in my opinion, kickstarted the whole process. This is when everybody started thinking, how can we take it into account? First of all, because if you want to manage some risk, you first need to identify those risks. So this was the beginning of the process. And here is a short timeline just outlining what has happened over the past 6 years. It started with the Financial Stability Board initiative to take into account climate risk in the financial the climate risk on the financial system. Then in December 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. In the same year, TCFD group was created, and by 2017, they already published their recommendations of how the climate risks have to be taken into account and reported by the corporations to their stakeholders, so that they understand where we are in respect of the climate risks and specifically financial risks associated with climate. And 2019, the PRA, which is a branch of the Bank of England, published its requirements, expectations of how the banks in the UK have to address the climate risks. And this year, we are going to have in June, in fact, in a couple of months, just a couple of weeks, actually, we are going to have the first regulatory climate stress test. UK is going to be the first country that has a regulatory climate stress test. Other countries, France and Netherlands, they did pilot studies, either themselves or inviting banks on a voluntary basis to participate, but no one had a regulatory stress test. So ours is going to be the first. We had a call with the Bank of England just this morning, which was quite interesting. The task that is set in front of the banks in the UK is very challenging. We are expected to stress test our whole books on climate, financial, macroeconomic consequences of the climate change, and not at the portfolio level, as usually we do for the stress test, but at the counterparty level. Obviously, we will not be able to do it for every individual counterparty, but there is a long list of what types of counterparties we need to do one by one individual analysis and say what risks, physical transition each of them has, including mortgages at individual property level. So it's going to be very interesting, very challenging exercise. We spent the past year preparing for it, and we're going to spend the summer going through it. So, and if you have a interest in it and questions, then once it's all over, maybe I can come back and tell you how it went. Definitely we are not going to be aboard this summer. And now I want to return back to how do we manage the risks and how do we take them into account? Me being an economist, I start always thinking of converting one type of risk into the other, much more digestible, the economic risks. Because the climate variables are very difficult for the banks to take into account, and we are more used to dealing with the macroeconomic forecast, and this is definitely going to play a role. We need to understand basically what is the link between the climate risks and the economic environment. How is climate risk being translated into the economic shocks, and what are the entry channels or the transmission channels from one to the other. And when thinking about the scenarios, I put them into three buckets. This is my personal classification. Doesn't mean that anybody else needs to use it, but this is how I think about the scenarios. There are a set of scenarios that describe what we want to happen. So this is our desirable outcome from the business point of view, from the humankind point of view, and the targets that we set ourselves. So this is where your well below 2 degrees scenarios, 1.5 degrees scenarios with a long-term view, that principles for responsible banking, principles for responsible investing, they are taken into account these scenarios. We talk about science-based targets in the same set of scenarios, and Paris alignment to the Paris targets. I'll talk about it in a minute as well. Then there is a second set of scenarios. What we think will happen. Do we actually believe that we are on track for 1.5 degrees by the end of the century or not? Is transition happening fast enough or not fast enough? And here I'm thinking that obviously the choice is going to be individual in each case. And some institutions are going to decide that they actually overlap. What we want to happen and what we think it will happen does overlap. So there is not necessarily a difference between the two. But here I'm thinking more about the short-term view. So our usual horizon, the next 5 years, how the structure of the economy is going to be changing, it will determine the following 10 years, and therefore it will kind of be a precursor of the transition. These are the scenarios that we're using for the planning, for the budgeting, our base case. And in the UK, at least, there is a strong push and expectation that the banks are going to start taking into consideration climate risks in their base case scenarios that we're using for planning and budgeting purposes. And then there is a third bucket, what we need to prepare for. And as you know, if there are risk professionals on the call, you know that we need to prepare for everything. And in climate terms, this means that the whole range of temperatures from the 1.5 degrees up to 5 degrees, some are talking about 8 degrees, but I have to say that I think that those wild projections are probably already off the table with the level of activity that we have. And these are your stress tests. They can be internal stress tests, ICAP scenarios, or external regulatory stress test. And for us, it's going to be, I'm calling it BES here. This is how the UK climate stress test is called. It's called the biennial exploratory scenario. So this is what we're going to look at in June this year. But despite the fact that there are all sorts of types of scenarios that we are looking at, the mechanisms that are connecting climate to the economy are still the same. And if we are able to identify those channels that are linking one to the other, then we can create all sorts of beautiful and wonderful scenarios. And the good place to start, if you start thinking about scenarios, the good place to start is NGFS scenarios. NGFS is the Network for Greening Financial System. This is a group of banks, central banks and regulators from all around the world. It's at the moment it has 87 members and 13 observers in its ranks. And the purpose of this network of regulators is to champion analysis of climate risk in the financial system and inclusion of those considerations into our assessment of the financial stability in the future. And they do a great job. And one of the streams of work that they're doing is development of the scenarios. The idea here is that to be able to do analysis across the world, and climate change being a global issue, we need to be able to have a global analysis. We need to start at least using the same language and using the same starting position. And it's good if scenarios that we're using for future assessment of the climate change at least close to each other. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to compare to understand which institutions and which countries are more at risk and less at risk if we're using different scenarios. So they proposed, they published this set of scenarios, which they classified according to two parameters: how high are transition risk, high or low, and how high are physical risks, high or low. And in the first set of scenarios, which was published July last year, they selected only 3 of the types of scenarios. The first, 2 of them are transition scenarios, and 1 of them is a scenario without any transition. And transition, according to the NGFS, can happen orderly, where everything goes according to plan. We start transitioning early, we are ramping up the pressure gradually. This allows us to get to the net zero emissions by about mid-century, 2070, and well below 2 degrees warming by the end of the century. The second type of scenario is disorderly. In this scenario, we have, first of all, we do nothing until 2030. So we delayed the transition by 10 years. And then on top of this, not all the technology is available for the transition. So this carbon dioxide, CDR is carbon dioxide removal. So this technology is only limited availability. This means that because we postponed the transition, because the technological advancements are not forthcoming, it's much harder to transition. It creates much more disruption. It means that we need to move much quicker in order to still stay below 2 degrees by the end of the century. So that's the second transition scenario, which happens with high transition risks. And the third type of scenario they call the hothouse world. This is a scenario where we continue as we are, going on current policies. National determined contributions are not met, emissions keep increasing, leading to more than 3-degree warming by the end of the century. So they published different variants of each of these broad narratives, but they selected some of those scenarios that they published, and they call them marker scenarios. So they're thinking that kind of adding a little additional badge of approval to those 3 scenarios, which they call marker scenarios. And here I'm just showing you a quick summary of how those narratives translate into the climate variables. Obviously, this is just the very high level summary. Each scenario contains hundreds of variables, but they all more or less in terms of the narrative boil down to the following story. The carbon price, which is the only instrument that you can change in the scenario, policy instrument that you can change in the scenario to influence your emissions. So the carbon price determines your carbon emissions, and the emissions determine your greenhouse gas concentrations, and concentration determines your global mean temperature. And here you can see that in the hothouse world, there is no increase in carbon price. Carbon price stays quite low at the current level. Then in the orderly scenario, we see quite a remarkable increase in the carbon price, and this increase happens relatively quickly. If you look at the scale, then by 2030, the carbon price is already in the region of $100 per ton. So currently, European emission scheme, I think, is around $25 per ton. So very rapid increase in carbon price. And in the disorderly scenario, even faster. So no change until 2030, and then very rapid and very quick, and some would say crazy increase in carbon price by the middle of the century. The emissions is the mirror image of your carbon price. The higher the carbon price, the lower the emissions, and kind of all the lines more or less flip around for the second chart. Emissions keep growing in the hothouse world and declining steadily in the orderly scenario, and more quickly and disruptively in the disorderly scenario. One interesting thing about the global mean temperature, if you look at this chart, there is very little difference between the 3 scenarios. Despite the fact that we have different level of emissions, different level of carbon price, which differ quite greatly, the global mean temperature doesn't. So, and here there are 2 reasons. First of all, small variation in global mean temperature means huge impacts on climate and our livelihoods. So this is number 1. So 0.1% change in global mean temperature is still quite significant. But more importantly, the reason the 3 scenarios have very similar global mean temperature is because over the next 30 years, no matter what we do now, there is very little we can do about the global mean temperature, because it depends on the current level of the carbon or greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And this is like a stock of your emissions, right? And it takes time for these emissions to dissipate and get out of the atmosphere. So more or less the next 3 decades already been baked in what temperature we're going to get by the middle of the century. And this is what those scenarios are showing. Which is creates an additional challenge from the policy perspective of how do you, the climate is going to keep warming, even if we are going to go aggressively for the transition. So this is, it's a difficult message to communicate for policymakers, but this is something that the climate scientists have warned us about. After the middle of the century, there is a difference between the 3 scenarios, obviously, and they start diverging, but this happens later than the the first 30 years, which is the focus of this analysis that I'm showing you here. What we did, we took these scenarios and we basically took the climate variables out of the NGFS scenarios, and we put them into the macroeconomic model, which is more conventional for the analysis that the banks are used to in our stress testing and other exercises when creating macroeconomic forecasts. Now, obviously, you need a model which is adapted and is able to take already model these channels that are connecting economy with the climate with the economy, and we were working together with two consultancy groups. One is Vivid Economics, who was helping us to disaggregate the NGFS scenarios to a country level, because NGFS scenarios are given at the regional level, and regions can be quite large. Europe, for example, Europe is very diverse in terms of the climate behavior. So you need additional help to disaggregate this to a country level. And then from the macroeconomic point of view, from the modeling, we worked with the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. This is a research institute in London, and they have a global macroeconomic model, which about 2 years ago, when they saw that the focus on climate is increasing, they started adapting this model to change it and allow more channels of incorporation of the climate effects into the macroeconomic model. So if there is any interest for this kind of work, I thoroughly recommend going to the National Institute. I also going to probably through Hector or some organizers later share with you a link to the webinar that we had, where we described in detail this work of how we were modeling the links between the climate and the economy. So yeah, you can see this recording. But basically here is the short story. The short story is that these are the impact channels that we were able to model at this early stage. It doesn't mean that this is an exhaustive list. But this is definitely a big step forward relative to where we were just a couple of months ago. So we were able to model the carbon taxes, and this is relatively easy. We all know how the economy is reacting to taxes. You just need to make sure that the channels through which the taxes are being modeled are correct. Then we modeled energy demand by fuel, energy prices by fuel, and stranded assets. This is where the cost of assets is changing. I'm saying they separately because on top of the macroeconomic model, we had to use some other additional models to get this channel modeled. In terms of the physical channels, what we were able to model is annual average damages from flooding, change in agriculture and labor productivity, and adaptation to the physical changes in different countries. The things we were not modeling are other types of perils. We didn't model impacts from the wildfires, freeze, tropical cyclones. We didn't, so the reason for it, because we didn't have the good reliable data on it, but also the link between the climate change and those perils is weaker than for the flooding. For flooding, there is a lot of literature that explains to you how the climate change is going to affect the sea level rise and how is it going to affect precipitation levels, and therefore surface flooding. Much less reliable connection between the climate change and cyclones. First of all, you need the frequency, severity of the cyclones, and the path that the cyclones are taking. This is much harder to predict. And the last, but definitely not least, the thing we are not taking into account, and possibly this is like an elephant in the room, various social aspects of the climate change, international conflicts, migration, effects on human health. And this is going to be huge. For example, it's definitely going to be huge for countries like the United Kingdom, because we're not expecting very serious physical impacts on our country itself. But there will be huge impacts in other parts of the world, and where those impacts are going to be very important and very disruptive. The people are not going to suffer in silence. So if the climate change is going to result in World War III, the whole of the world is going to feel the consequences of this. We are not doing it. Nobody has done it, and this is something that is very difficult to plan or predict, but we need to keep it in mind that any results of modeling that we are presenting here or anybody else is presenting elsewhere, most likely done under a specified list of assumptions or the channels that they're able, constraints basically for this view. So this is not kind of final and definitive answer. So I'm only going to show you this one chart with the results. If you're interested in this sufficiently, I do advise you to follow the webinar link that I will send to you after this talk. But what we have learned here is the following. So here, just a couple of countries and 3 different scenarios. So, and high-level conclusions from me. First of all, orderly and first of all, transition is affordable. We can afford transition. It doesn't require a lot of sacrifice in output. Orderly transition is definitely preferable to disorderly transition, which is not surprising. And depending on how you specify the scenario and what assumptions you make about your how transition is going to happen, it's possible to get positive outcome from the transition. In order to get the positive outcome out of transition, what you have, the question is where the investment necessary for the transition is going to come from. Is it additional investment, or is it or are we going to redirect the current investment, and some of the investment in the current capital is going to be changed into renewable energy and into changing the way we power our economy. So, and this is quite a crucial question. For example, for the UK, the estimate is that for the net zero transition to net zero by 2050, starting from 2025, we will need in the region of £50 billion a year invested in this process. Obviously, if you're going to have such a massive inflow of capital in the economy, this will have a stimulating effect. It will have a positive impact on GDP. So the question is very strongly about the assumptions and about the, and this is to some extent about the practice, how the world is going to react to it. The capital is there. The private enterprises, corporations, they have this, and investors, they have this money. Are they going to direct this money into transition to net zero? So that's question number 1, and quite substantial. But even if you don't assume that the investment has a stimulating impact, for example, on those charts, they're done under the most conservative set of assumptions possible. We don't expect, we just didn't model it. Even then, if you see the deviation from baseline, growth is very small, and in some countries, insignificant by the end of the period. So here we don't see the same level of it's not a big stress for the economy. Another question with the hothouse world scenario. This is the most uncertain scenario, the highest uncertainty of how to model it. First of all, big uncertainty about what level of temperature you're going to achieve for a given level of emissions. So this is number 1. The second one, how we're going to adapt to this new environment and new climate that we're living in. Adaptation in particular has absolutely massive impact on the how disruptive this scenario is by about 10 times. So all the damages from the hothouse world scenario, if we have adaptation assumption, you need to multiply it by 10 times, and then you get to no adaptation assumption, roughly. So this is absolutely huge. Another interesting thing is orderly and disorderly transition across the world in different countries, comparable magnitude of the effects. With the hothouse world, very different shocks for different countries. Obviously, if you are in the north of Europe, as I am, the impacts are quite small. If you are closer to the equator or in Russia, as I've discovered now, then the effects are much stronger going to be. So this is just the kind of high level results. And now I want to conclude with just one example of how the institutions in financial sector addressing it and what we are doing in this space. NatWest Group last year published our new purpose. So we are now a purpose-led organization. We set out the purpose of our operations, and our purpose has three pillars. And one of those pillars is climate. So we set ourselves a target to become a leading UK and the Republic of Ireland bank, helping to address the climate challenge. So that's our current manifestation of our purpose. And here on this slide is just a quick summary, I have to say, not non-exhaustive list of various activities and targets and achievements that we have in this area. And you need to keep in mind that this is all relatively new. As I said, only a year or year and a half ago, we started working in this direction. So obviously we have a special funding targets for renewable energy or sustainable, in generally for sustainable causes. We are canceling some of the finance to the most harmful activities. The thermal coal is being removed from the books. The question is about the oil and gas majors, only if they have a credible transition path, things like that. But this is pretty standard. What I wanted to talk to you about for a last minute is on the left-hand side, the second aim is we set ourselves the target to halve the emissions from our own operation, not from own operation, have the climate impact of our financial activity. What this means is that we first of all want to estimate what our how much emissions are we supporting through our lending portfolio, and then we set ourselves a target to reduce this by 50% by 2030. And over the past year and into this year, and probably it will last a couple of years ahead as well, we are doing this big project. We call it the Paris alignment. We want to align our operations to make sure that our activity is aligned with the Paris goals. Therefore, first of all, we need to calculate the emissions from all of our book, and the portion of this that is attributable to us. And then for each of the sectors, we are setting ourselves a transition path from the level of the emission concentration that is at the moment, and how is it going to be transitioning by 2030 to make sure that we are kind of collectively reducing our financed emissions by 50%. So I thought this is a few banks are doing this in the West. I know, but this is still not a mainstream, I would say. So I thought that this would be an interesting example of how to demonstrate that banks are really seriously taking it on board, and not only we are preparing for our stress testing, but we're also changing our strategy and pivoting our own operations. And one last thing to mention here is that the target is not to to divest from certain activities which are less sustainable or less clean, but to ensure that our clients are transitioning together. Because if we want to achieve net zero by 2050, this doesn't leave you a room for divesting. This means that everybody has to transition. So we need to find the solutions, and we need as a bank to support those solutions that will allow everyone to get on this new Paris-aligned path, and by 2050 get to net zero collectively. So here I would like to stop, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And I can see that there are already a number of questions.
Thank you, Katerina. So let me.
I'll stop sharing.
Perfect.
And we can look at the.
So. Okay, thank you. Let me just.
Yes, I will. We will send the slide. You will send the slides.
We will send the slide, and also if you could after the webinar send us the link. To the
I will send the link to this webinar that I mentioned.
Exactly,
yes.
and I will share everything. So. Okay, so thank you very much, Katerina, for the very interesting presentation. I mean, there's a lot of talk about green. Climate change lately for the past years, but it was, for me personally, it was very eye-opening to see this this map of Russia and how it's the projection in 100 years. I've never seen that before, and it's actually a bit scary. So it's another incentive for Russia and Russian corporates and the financial system to actually put hands on task.
It was a big shock to me as well, because in many discussions, Russia is being portrayed as a beneficiary of the climate change. You know, because of the fact that the North Passage is going to be open from the ice, and in general, I think that the discourse in the country is definitely not alarmist in this respect. But this is a forecast by official agency. So Gidromet Center is official.
I saw the source, so it's actually reliable.
Therefore, this is not some foreign agents who are trying to portray situation exactly. There is.
So this is quite eye-opening. So yeah, again, thank you. So I have a couple of questions. When we talk about modeling, obviously it's very important to have data, right? And we have different data, different variables. So how, for example, for financial modeling is quite straightforward, because we have the IFRS, and if you take a look at the financial statements from companies, it's 99% sure that they're accurate, they're comparable. For climate data, how do you deal with data, with some greenwashing problems from some companies? So how do you control for this when you model and when you use this data?
That's a very good question, and that's every time we're discussing any challenges or any problems that the banks are facing with respect to managing these climate risks. Number one on any discussion is the data. First, and this comes in all sorts of flavors. First of all, data availability. So some things are just not reported, not counted at the moment. Second of all, the data coverage. And third, what you mentioned, the data reliability. How do we deal with it? The answer is with difficulty, but with a lot of time and money, a lot becomes possible. We need to accept that the data is not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be perfect not for 1 or 2 years. It's not going to be perfect for a long period of time. So we collect what we can. We use different sources to cross-check the reporting. Another thing is that the TCFD is going to currently is just being developed, and more corporations start reporting under it, and it sets specific requirements of how do you have to report. And another thing was recently I read specifically for the financial. Who was it? Is it IFRS? IFRS is planning to set the standard, a new international standard on reporting with respect to the climate risks as well. So we are moving in the right direction. We are starting from a very inferior position with respect to data. We like the bank, you know, we're already a year on the journey of collecting the data, and we still nowhere near the full coverage. We're buying third-party data. We are engaging directly one-on-one with our counterparties, collecting data this way. For example, for our agricultural clients, we developed together with the third sector provider a tool how to calculate the emissions of a farm, and we are providing these tools for free, so that they are going to first of all know themselves what is their position, report this back to us, and we can collectively find the solution of how we can get from where they are to where they need to be. So it's a very big mix of approaches. I think for me, the most important is not to expect perfection and just deal with what you have the best you can.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very important to actually, what you mentioned at the end was, and you mentioned it again right now, not only to divest, but to actually your current investment, your current loans, to help these companies transition. So actually my follow-up question was in regard to that, what you just mentioned, that currently most non-financial reporting, sustainability reporting is mostly used sort of like as a narrative from the company, right? To say, okay, I'm green, I'm social. So I think it's actually very important, these new IFRS, let's say, what they're pushing, which is the Sustainability Standards Board, which will combine the IFRS reports, financial reporting with climate reporting into one single report, which is very good because, for example, now for an oil company, they value their assets based only on financial and economic sources, but not really on, okay, what is the climate impacts in the future? No? So this, in my opinion, this would be a very, very important step to actually consolidate these two types of reporting. So I wanted to ask you your view on that, on this push by the IFRS in terms of doing that, and how this could help interpreting the data and using sort of like the financial data together with the climate data in order to model, you know, more accurately what the impact will be for the companies.
Well, definitely is very welcome. So any push for more systematic and comparable approach, we definitely welcome this. The companies, I wouldn't say that all they do is the narrative reporting. The large corporations are already reporting the emissions. They report scope 1, 2, and some of them report scope 3. Because of the investors are very interested, and we see the interest from the investor groups in the UK definitely over the past couple of years increased dramatically. So now every time we as a company, as a corporate, reports into our investors and all of our results, the focus on the climate component of our report every year is higher and higher, and the expectations will always exceed of what you are able to report. So every time you think that this year I managed to meet the expectations that were set by the investors last year, but the expectations are already ahead of you. So you have to run just to stay still, as they say. But this is a good thing. As I said, my opinion is that we need to accept this, that this is going to be a changing environment for a foreseeable future, and you do it on the best endeavor approach, as good as you can in the current circumstances, keeping in mind that as new information becomes available, new data becomes available, we need to always look back and do the adjustments to our estimates. To be honest, this project that I mentioned, Paris Alignment, where we are first of all footprinting all of our portfolio, and second of all setting the targets. You can imagine that this is very data heavy project. We managed to. We're still in the process of it, but we are managing to collect much more data than we thought initially that is available. So the data sources are also developing as we speak. So that's why you need to constantly keep your eyes on it and kind of not lose hope. I would, and another thing for anybody who is thinking of embarking on this journey, don't allow the data availability to stop you, because in broad terms we can you can already estimate a lot of things. It's not going to be a precise number, but precise number will never be available. With climate, the level of uncertainty there is in climate modeling, apart from the fact that what we report in terms of emissions. So the climate modeling itself is so prone to error and not error. It has such a wide margins of error statistically that not having a precise number about the emissions that this company is having is not the only the problem that we have to deal with. But the broad picture we're still able to we still are able to capture, and we know already which sectors are going to be your red flags, which sectors are going to be your green flags. You can get this information at this level of kind of heat mapping exercise is available with very little information, very little data. Okay,
thank you, Katerina. So I have a couple of more questions, but we're running out of time. So let's go to the questions from the audience. So could you please elaborate a bit more on the macroeconomic modeling itself that you do in NWG, and how do these models work?
Well, the model that I presented here is the model from the it's called the model NIGEM. It's modeled by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. So that's the structural macroeconomic model. It covers the whole world. It has about 50 countries individually, and all the largest countries, all the OECD countries, and then the rest of it grouped in regions. What to say about this model? If you're familiar with structural macroeconomic model, it has the similar approach. All of them, all of these models have similar approach. You have a demand side that determines your short-term dynamics, and you have the long run, which determined by the supply side. And you have sticky prices, which creates a little bit of an imperfect adjustment, sluggish adjustment from one period to the next. The whole world is linked by the capital flow and international trade, and within each of the economy, you can account for the sources of demand and the factors of production that determine your long-term supply capacity. Depending on how detailed each individual country model, you will have the government sector, which can be quite detailed with different types of taxes and spending avenues, or some countries don't have such a detailed accounts, and they will only have a domestic demand without any specifically government sector modeled separately. So if there is a specific question about this model, I can answer. But the more interesting thing here is how does the climate enters it. So they created this carbon tax as a separate tax in each of the country. So you know where you collect it. It depends on the level of emissions that you have, and then you can also choose what happens to it. So you can choose whether the government reduces other types of taxes because it has higher revenues, whether it pays out the debt and reduces the government debt, or it can use this money for investment and consumption. So depending on the choice, quite substantially different outcomes the modeling has. Then in their production function, which determines your long-term productive capacity, they have three types of inputs. It's labor, capital, and energy. So they took the energy and disaggregated it into the renewable energy and the non-renewable energy, and that's why you can model this transition through changes in your energy mix. On top of this, they created one more channel that looks at the energy efficiency within the economy. So you can take into account the fact that over the transition, energy efficiency is going to decline, and for a given level of energy, we're still able to produce a higher level of output. What else was there? I think these are the main channels. And then of course physical impacts. The physical impacts we were modeling directly as a hit to your productive capacity. So if it's annual average damages, this means that your capital stock in the long run is being reduced. We calibrated the size of this shock based on the GDP annual average damages, and if it's a more gradual increase in agricultural and labor productivity, then this was the a different parameter they used for chronic impacts of the climate change. There is more details about this side of it in the webinar that I'm going to send you a link to. So this is because there we spend a whole hour just talking about how we did that.
Yeah, when we share the presentation, then we can also share the link to the webinar that you will send us with the audience. So there's another question. Could you please elaborate on the climate indexes and climate ETFs used in the UK?
No, this is not something.
This
is not something that I pay attention to. I know that they exist. I also know that over the past year they overperformed your usual ETFs. So the 2020 was a good year if you were a green investor. I know that there is a lot of interest to it. I also know that we are ourselves, NatWest Group, issued green bonds, and green bonds are coming in all sorts of flavors and shapes. Even the Bank of England is planning to issue a green bond itself. So definitely a bubbling area, but I wouldn't be able to give you a lot of information about that.
Okay, and the last question. How do the disorderly and hothouse world scenarios differ in terms of costs? Because they look actually very similar. They look similar, maybe, but they actually don't look similar. So first of all, the challenges are very different, right? So you have transition impacts are very high in the disorderly, and it's physical impacts that are influencing your hothouse world. And second of all, even though there is a sharp jump in 2030 in this disorderly scenario, after this, there is this kind of gradual increase in taxes, and gradual as in not slow, but still gradual increase in taxes, and this is influencing your long-term damages to the economy. In the hothouse world, very much depends on where you are in the world. So if you are in the UK, the damages are very small. If you are in China, the damages are huge. If you are Vietnam, Vietnam was for some reason was the most well, not for some reason. You know where Vietnam is located. So Vietnam had a very serious, the worst impact from the hothouse world scenario. Another big difference. I only showed you one version of the hothouse world scenario. We had, I think, about 20 different versions, and the reason for it is, as I said, it depends on what you assume about how the temperature is going to react to your emissions. This is number one. And the second one, whether you're going to have adaptation in place or not. So I picked one, which is the 50th percentile of the temperature response and no adaptation. So that's the one I'm showing you. But we had all sorts of mixtures. We had the 95th percentile temperature response with adaptation, without adaptation, just to look at the sensitivity of how the results depend on different assumptions we're making about this scenario. And as I said, this scenario is very
sensitive to the assumptions you make about adaptation in particular, and where you are located in around the globe. Disorderly scenario doesn't have that. First of all, it doesn't have the sensitivity to any strong assumptions, and second of all, more or less all the countries have a similar impact, rather than, which is irrespectively where you are located around the world.
Okay, Katerina, thank you so much. So as I said, I have a couple of more questions. Very interesting topic, very interesting talking to you, but unfortunately we're already a bit 15 minutes after the hour. But again, Katerina, thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting presentation, very interesting conversation. And yeah, as you said, maybe we can have you again after all the summer projects that you have, so you can tell us what was the outcome and what was the experience. So
yeah, let's see how it goes. Let's hope that it will be successful.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Katerina, once again, and thank you everyone for joining us. And here in the screen you can see the upcoming webinars, 5th of May, and then yeah, 12th of May and 19th of May. So you can go to our website and register there, and also you can join our Telegram channel. There is a link which we will send you. So Katerina, thanks again. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.